It seems that most people are deeply dissatisfied with their lives and would like for things to be different. But as much as we desire for life to be different or better, whatever that means to you, typically any real significant change is rare. And that can be in regard to so many areas: your job, your relationships, your lifestyle, but overall the quality of life itself, whether you're happy, content, at peace. So, today I'm going to talk about what I think is the most important factor in actually changing your life. Not just wishing for change, but actually tapping into the power to change. As I said, most people are deeply dissatisfied with life, and most people say that they would like their lives to be different, to be better, to be more fulfilling, happier, more joyful, etc. But what I've often observed is that while most people want change, they don't want to change themselves. They want everything else to change: the circumstances, the other people in their life, and so on. And this seems to me to be the main reason why things don't tend to change for many of us. And instead, we go on waiting and complaining, getting more and more frustrated and disappointed. Sometimes a person will complain to me about their life or some specific situation in their life, and I'll offer them a suggestion that I know from my own experience is instrumental and maybe even essential to bringing about the kind of change that they desire. But often they'll come up with some excuse as to why that's not going to work for them, and it usually has to do with some external influence which appears to be beyond their control. And certainly there are some things which work for some and not for others. Certainly our circumstances differ from one person to another, and certainly there are things in life which are outside of our control. But typically what the person is usually expressing is that they don't really want to change anything themselves. They want their circumstances to change, they want their environment to change, they want other people around them to change, but they don't want to change. And so naturally, things don't tend to change for them. Life just goes on as usual: the same situations, the same reoccurring patterns, the same complaints. And they go on complaining as if somehow that's going to change their circumstances. Many of us often feel like victims in life: victims of our circumstances, victims of culture, victims of other people's actions, behavior, and so on. And just having this mentality of victimhood creates in us a sense of powerlessness, because that's what it is essentially to be a victim: to be in a position of being powerless to change the situation. So if you have that kind of mentality that you're simply a helpless victim, then you're never going to change anything, and you'll always go on being a victim. And if that's fine with you, then you can go ahead and keep doing that. But if you really want things to change, then you're gonna have to stop being a victim. And this is, I think, so difficult for a lot of people to hear. In fact, people who have this victim mentality deeply ingrained often get very defensive about that victim identity. They're so attached to being a victim, attached to being helpless, and when someone challenges that, as I'm doing right now, the tendency is to feel even more victimized. But that's the way victim mentality works. You're always looking for something to confirm your sense of victimhood. And probably the most offensive thing is to have someone challenge that. But like I said, if you want to be a victim all your life, then keep looking for excuses to remain a victim. Keep telling yourself that you're helpless. Keep looking for anyone else to blame, and never take any responsibility for yourself. What it really comes down to is that most people don't want to take any personal responsibility in their lives. And that's the thing I really want to address, because if you really want to see your life change, you have to start taking responsibility for yourself. When it comes to taking responsibility for yourself, for your own life, I think a lot of people misunderstand this, confusing it as ignoring or disregarding other people's accountability or fault or what have you. So, for example, if someone is abusive toward you, taking responsibility isn't to suggest that it's your fault that they behave that way, and it doesn't mean that you're minimizing their accountability or condoning or excusing their behavior. In fact, often it's when we don't take responsibility for ourselves that we often tend to take the blame for other people's abusive behavior. We might convince ourselves that somehow we deserve it, or at the very least, we might make excuses for them. They've had a hard life, and so it's understandable that they're frustrated and that they're easily angered. And while that may explain their behavior, it doesn't excuse it. There's a difference between excuse and an explanation. When I talk about taking responsibility for yourself, I'm talking about recognizing your own power, your own ability to respond. But when we're a victim, we don't tend to respond. We tend to just tolerate the situation and hope that the situation changes itself somehow, or that someone else takes responsibility to change it. Responsibility means that we have the power to change the situation, or at the very least to change the way we respond to it. So if there is a way out of the situation, we'll find it. And if there isn't, we'll find a better way to respond to it. And that in and of itself will likely have influence over the situation, causing it to change in a more positive direction. But even if the external situation doesn't change very much, we still have the power to change the way we look at it, the way we interpret it, the way we feel about it, and so on. But more importantly, we need to understand how our own thoughts may be contributing to that situation. To give an example from my own life, I was in a situation where I was being taken advantage of. I was being emotionally manipulated by this other person, and it seemed to be causing so much frustration in my life. And on the surface, caught up in all that resentment and disappointment and so on, all I could see was how this other person was so disrespectful, inconsiderate, selfish, and so on, and how I was a victim of all of that. Because after all, I tend to be the opposite of those things. I'm very respectful, considerate, selfless, generous, and so on. So clearly I'm doing everything right, and the other person is entirely at fault, and I'm just a helpless victim of that person's manipulation. But when I was able to step back and turn around and look within, I began to see that I was also contributing to that situation. After all, I was allowing myself to be manipulated. And the reality was that the only power this person had over me was the power that I was giving to them. So that was really all on me. That was my responsibility. Now, that's not to excuse their behavior, not at all. What they were doing was indeed selfish and inconsiderate, but I also knew that there was nothing I could do to change them. We don't have that kind of power to change other people. And also, I eventually came to accept that they probably weren't going to change. And if I were to sit around waiting for that to happen, I could die waiting. So if I wanted anything to change, that was going to be my responsibility. So I started looking inwardly to understand why I was giving my power over to them. And once I understood and began resolving my own personal insecurities and so on, I was no longer susceptible to their manipulation. It just didn't work on me anymore. I was no longer giving into it, and so it stopped. In fact, without being able to take advantage of me, there was really no other reason for that person to be in my life, and so that relationship naturally dissolved. So my life changed in regard to that situation quite effortlessly, simply because I took responsibility for myself. I stopped being a helpless victim, and I stopped giving my power away. So when we complain about our lives, what we're usually doing is putting all the responsibility on everyone and everything else to change, and hoping with a great deal of frustration and disappointment that somehow, some way, someone else will accept that responsibility and change the situation. What we fail to realize is that often we're that someone who we're waiting for, who has to accept responsibility and change the situation. And as I said, if we're waiting for someone else to do that, we could go on waiting forever. So, what are you waiting for? Step up, take responsibility for yourself, take back your power, and be the change you wish to see in your own life. If you find this content valuable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.